Hey everyone, and welcome to part 3 of this line and watercolor wash flower series that I am creating for anyone who is just getting started with line and wash or who's looking to learn how to draw different types of flowers. If you haven't checked out parts 1 and 2, I would highly recommend going through those first before jumping into today's exercise, because in parts 1 and 2 I cover how to draw 6 different flowers that fit into the 6 main categories or shapes of flowers that you can find out there, which are circle, trumpet, bowl, bell, combination, and variation. More specifically, I teach you how to draw daisies, morning glories, peonies, tulips, daffodils, and orchids. I share how to visualize these different flowers as simple shapes and how to draw them step by step from different perspectives. I also share how I like to practice my drawing in my sketchbook before going ahead and doing my work on my watercolor sheet and bringing my flowers to life with my favorite pen and ink techniques and also bright watercolor washes. I'll make sure to link to the past 2 episodes in the description box below. And I want to encourage you to spend as long as you need to with those past 2 episodes and practicing those individual flowers in isolation, because in this one, we're going to be bringing everything together to draw and paint a full flower bouquet. I'm going to be sharing exactly what I do to plan and prepare for great balanced results through doing rough sketches in my sketchbook, and alongside that I'm going to be providing lots of tips on composition and how to arrive at great results with this kind of piece. With all that said, let's jump in. Alright, so starting out with my planning and prep phase, I'm going to have both of these watercolor sheets where I have all of these different flowers that I have practiced in the last 2 episodes right in front of me as I am working on these sketches. This way I can have them as inspiration and they can remind me of how to draw each flower. I'm going to be working on 2 separate sketches where I'm going to be using different combinations of flowers. I always like starting out with a few rough sketches in my sketchbook, whether they are larger sketches like the ones that I'm going to be creating right now or smaller, quicker thumbnails. But I do make sure that the proportions of the square or rectangles that I am creating for myself to work in are roughly the proportions that I want my final piece to be. This way I can start planning how large I want my flowers and my overall flower bouquet to be in this space and how much negative inactive area I want around my flower bouquet. Planning for positive and negative spaces is such an important part of composition. It can really make or break your piece. You don't want your subject to be so small that it doesn't allow you to practice your drawing and your painting properly and it seems like it's floating in this vast sea of emptiness. But you also don't want it to be so large that it ends up not fitting in that space. When it comes to floral compositions, whether it's a bouquet or a wreath or any other kind of composition, the way that I like seeing it is you have your focal point, largest, most important flowers, and then you have your secondary flowers, which are going to be smaller than those largest flowers, and then you have your tertiary, smallest elements, which can be smaller flowers, grasses, or other types of things like that, which are going to help add fullness or volume to the piece. And what you're seeing me do now is I'm creating circles or ovals to visualize the size and placement or location of those largest, most prominent focal point flowers. Where do I want my largest, most important flowers to be? In composition design, there is something called the rule of odds. And it tells us that when we're gonna be bringing in multiple elements, we should consider making them an odd number as opposed to an even number. So this is why I went with 3 focal point elements. Making use of the rule of odds is going to help you arrive at more aesthetically pleasing visual compositions that are a little bit more interesting to look at. I'm also making sure to place my focal point flowers in a triangular positioning or shape in relation to each other. I'm always looking for asymmetry as I am arranging these elements in space. I don't want the left half of my piece to be the same as the right half of my piece. because that is not going to be so interesting to look at. It's almost always going to be best to find a way to create asymmetrical balance, which means that the elements in the left half of your piece are going to be different from the elements in the right half of your piece. But as an artist, you're strategically playing with shape, scale, color, all of these different things and levers that you can manipulate to create different visual weights in the elements in your piece, so that at the end you do arrive at a sense of balance, even though those elements that you've brought in the left and right halves of the piece are different. After choosing 3 specific flowers for my focal point flowers, I started drawing them using the steps that I provided in the previous episodes. For this one, I choose to bring in 2 peonies and 1 daisy. I thought peonies would be a great flower for focal point flowers because they are nice and large. I will make sure to draw these 2 peonies in different perspectives though, because this will help me create a more natural look. An extra challenge that comes with drawing flower bouquets is that we have to make it look like all of these flowers are connected or joined at the same point. So in other words, the stems all have to look like they are very close together at the end if we want it to look like a bouquet. And so when we're drawing those petal sections, we want to visualize the appropriate orientation in space and tilt, so that when we do add in that stem at the base of that petal section and we pull that stem down, it looks like it is right beside the other stems. So for many of these, you're going to see me use that central vertical that I was talking about in previous episodes to help me draw the petals successfully. Remember that axis that I was adding as I was sketching these flowers in the past 2 episodes? You're going to see me make use of that central vertical line again and again. Some of these flowers have to look like they're looking toward the left, and others have to look like they're looking toward the right, and maybe some of them are facing upward. I'm trying to create a nice variety of flower orientations and tilts so that everything looks natural. But I always have that stem in mind and how all of the stems need to look like they are joined or very close together at the bottom. And you do want to make sure that you don't forget to add a stem for any of these flowers, because it might look like they are floating in the air. After drawing my 3 main flowers, I created smaller ovals where I thought the secondary flowers would look good. With those secondary smaller ovals added in, I then started drawing the other smaller flowers. My smaller flowers were a couple of daisies and a couple of morning glories. One of those daisies was quite small though, so that could be seen as a tertiary filler flower. Once I was done with those secondary flowers, I added in some teeny tiny filler flowers here and there, just for a little bit more fullness. And you're also going to see me add some grasses. With my pencil sketch ready, I went ahead and used this opportunity to practice and warm up with my pen and ink. This is very helpful. It helps me loosen up and make sure that I arrive at better results when time comes to create that final piece. Here I'm just making some quick notes for myself, making note of which my main flowers are for this particular sketch. And now I'm going to get started with the second sketch. For this one, my 3 main flowers are going to be, once again, a peony and a tulip and an orchid at the top. You can see how, in order to make sure that the tilt or orientation of this flower is what I want it to be, so that everything makes sense once I draw that stem and everything looks like it's part of the same bouquet, I make sure to start my drawing with that middle axis. Same thing here for this tulip. You can see how I'm drawing that axis where the middle of the tulip is going to be. In this sketch, I really wanted to challenge myself to bring in all 6 flowers that we have been practicing in this series. But it was important for me to choose which would be the main largest ones and which ones would be the secondary flowers. You're going to notice that I sketch 2 orchids at the top, and this is because of the nature of this particular flower. It would look weird if I just added in 1 orchid, because when it comes to orchids, there are usually several flowers growing out of one same stem. I also added a couple of extra flower bulbs that are part of the same orchid, but I am seeing only the larger, most visible orchid as one of the 3 primary flowers. With my 3 primary flowers in, I then added in some smaller ovals for my secondary flowers, and for those I added in a daffodil, a smaller daisy, and a morning glory at the bottom. But right here, you're going to see how, just like with the previous one, I actually shift down the top horizontal to bring down my drawing space a bit, just because I had too much empty space at the top, and I thought that it would be good to add in an extra small daisy at the bottom. And then I added in my extra filler elements, my teeny tiny wildflowers that are very quickly sketched in. You can see a few quick little wildflower elements sketched in the middle of my page here. These are more like scribbles, nothing too perfect. What's important is to sketch in those little wildflowers loosely and to not go overboard with the amount, because you don't want to drown out the primary and even secondary flowers. And it was time to do my inking practice. As I'm doing my pen and ink work, I'm also practicing noticing which elements are overlapping or covering up other elements that are behind them or next to them. I don't want to be tracing over sections of lines or edges of elements that wouldn't be visible at the end because they're actually being covered by something else. By this point, I'm already feeling a lot looser and more confident with my pen and ink. And I'm sure I'll do a much better job with my last piece because I took time to warm up and practice. I'm erasing out my graphite work, and I'm just going to add in a few notes for myself here to remember which my main flowers are going to be for this one. My final composition is going to be a lot closer to the second sketch than to the first, because I will be bringing in all 6 flowers. But I do notice some little changes and improvements that I want to make. Alright, so with that prep work out of the way, it is time to get started with my final piece on my watercolor sheet. This is hot press paper from Orchid, so it has no texture to it. It's completely smooth, and I am making sure to draw very, very lightly using an HB pencil so that I am able to erase my graphite work after my pen and ink has dried, and also so that I don't scratch or damage my watercolor paper. But hopefully you can see how I'm starting out with simple shapes, starting with those 3 main flowers that I want to make my largest, most prominent focal point flowers, which for me are going to be a peony on the bottom left, a tulip to the right of that, and then the one at the top is going to be an orchid. I also added in those axes so that I can start visualizing the tilt or the orientation of that petal section for each flower. And I also arranged them in that triangular positioning that I was talking about before. With my larger blocky shapes in for my main flowers, I then added in medium-sized shapes for my secondary flowers. My secondary flowers are going to be a daffodil, a morning glory, and I'm going to take that other orchid on the upper right as a secondary flower as well. And then my filler flowers are going to be a few smaller daisies that I'm going to be adding just from intuition after having sketched in all of my larger flowers and seeing how that looks. And of course, the teeny tiny wildflowers. I continue drawing as lightly as possible so that I can easily erase mistakes as I go, but I'm also trying to do as little erasing as possible. Once you've practiced these flowers in isolation enough, you can draw them pretty easily and pretty quickly. A little tip for you, once you start deciding what you're going to be doing for the secondary and tertiary flowers, is go ahead and add in simple shapes lightly in those areas where you're thinking of adding in those smaller flowers to get a better idea of whether you're actually going to like that flower in that area before actually taking the time to sketch that flower in. I'm all done with my pencil sketch, and right here I'm getting started with my pen and ink work, making sure that I'm not tracing over any edges of shapes that wouldn't really be visible because they are being covered up by something else. And I'm also making sure that I'm bringing in that line weight variation that I was talking about in a previous episode in this series. So making sure that some of my lines and marks are thicker and darker and others are thinner and lighter, because I know that this is going to lead to more dynamic, interesting looking results, and I can stay away from a flat look this way. And for the most part, the outer edges of my shapes are relatively thicker lines, whereas the lines and marks that I add inside of my petals and shapes are thinner and lighter. I have other pen and ink videos where I provide tips and exercises that will help you improve your control over your drawing pen. And also I talk about those 4 main variables or levers that you can manipulate to develop line weight variation, which are the speed at which you're moving your hand and arm, the angle that you're holding your pen at, the pressure that you're exerting on your pen, and also the pen tip size in and of itself. These are all things that you can actively explore and change along the drawing process so that you can develop that line weight variation. I'll make sure to leave links to some of my other pen and ink tips and tutorial videos down below so that you can go and check them out if you're interested. It was time to allow everything to dry for a couple of minutes, and then I used my soft graphite eraser to erase out all of my graphite work. And with that, it's finally time to get started with the watercolor washes. And just like with the other episodes in this series, you do not have to use the same paint colors that I'm going to be using for my flowers. You can definitely use different colors. So if you'd like to look up reference photos for the flower on hand to see what different colors you can use, definitely feel free to do that. I'm going to be using a couple of different round brushes to paint in the flowers and the stems. For the petal sections of the largest flowers, I'm going to be using my size 8 round brush. And for my stems and smaller flowers, I'll be using my size 4 round brush. I get started with my peony, and for this one, I use my Madder Lake Red Light from St. Petersburg White Nights, which is a cool red, making sure that I go in nice and watered down in the beginning so that I can create light value areas, and taking my time with that first palest layer of paint, running my paintbrush bristles over the entire shape multiple times so that once I drop in the same color in a little bit of a thicker state, I get those soft, gradual effects and transitions between my values. You can see me layer on a little bit more of this Madder Lake Red Light color in a bit of a thicker state, less watered down, in shadow areas that I'm looking to push a little bit more to help add more dimension to this peony. Once I have created a couple of different values, a lighter value, a mid-tone value, with the same cool red color, I then added some of my French ultramarine from Winsor & Newton into the mixture to create a darker value that is leaning more towards the purple side. And I dropped in that darker color into darkest areas that I was looking to push more. I'm going to be using the same process to paint in all of my flowers, especially the largest ones. And for the tulip, I primarily used New Gamboge from Winsor & Newton's professional line, but I start adding in a little bit of Pyrrole Red from Daniel Smith into my New Gamboge in order to darken that color and create a darker value for midtones and shadow areas. New Gamboge is a warm yellow and Pyrrole Red is a warm red. So here you can see how I'm starting to add in a little bit of that Pyrrole Red into the New Gamboge to create a little bit more of an orange color for mid-tone areas. And then I add in a little bit more Pyrrole Red to make it even darker and push those darkest shadow areas a little bit more. You can see how I'm getting these soft diffused effects, and this is because I took my time painting in that first palest layer. If I hadn't taken my time with that initial layer, running my paintbrush bristles over the entire shape multiple times, everything would have already started to dry, and I wouldn't be getting these soft wet on wet effects. I decide to paint my orchid purple. And because I already had a purplish color mixture going on my palette, all I do is add a little bit more of my French ultramarine into the mixture. Remember, that mixture is the same one that I was using for the peony, which is Madder Lake Red Light from St. Petersburg White Knights, and a little bit of my French ultramarine. So all I do is add more French ultramarine to turn it into more of a secondary purple, and then I use that in a pretty watered down state for that initial layer. And then I add a little bit more of my Madder Lake Red Light into the mixture for a little bit of color variation throughout the flower, so that some sections can look a little bit more like a red purple and others look more like a secondary purple. But overall, I'm focusing more on developing a nice range of values, having certain areas look a little bit lighter and others look a little bit darker, especially where shadow areas would be. I continue doing my sculpting throughout the petals until I arrive at something that I like, sometimes adding more color, more layering to darken areas, and other times I'm using the clean and only slightly damp bristles of my paintbrush as a little absorbent sponge to remove and lift off some of that color off the page to lighten areas and add dimension to those petals. I use that same combination of colors that I used in my first orchid for the second orchid as well, because they're coming out of the same stem. Same idea here, going in with a pale version of my color. I think I go in a little bit too dark initially, so I paint in a little bit of that color, then remove that color from my paintbrush bristles and go in with just water in my brush to soften that color before dropping in more. Because if I don't start with the light value and I only continue adding more color on top of that, I'm gonna create flat and heavy results. I need to make sure that I start light so that I have light value areas and a nice range of values. This is why it's so important that when we're working with watercolor, we make our way gradually from lights to darks, especially with something like this. And then it was time to paint the Morning Glory, which I wanted to make a light kind of bluish purple color. So I added more of my French ultramarine into this mixture that I've been using for the peony and the orchids, and I just made sure that it had just a small amount of red in it. It's mostly French ultramarine with a teeny tiny bit of red in it, but even as I'm using just one single color, I am making sure to go in with my color very watered down and pale initially, and then I'm going into darken shadow areas using that same color in a thicker state, so less watered down. And finally, it was time to paint in my third secondary flower, which is the daffodil. And I decided to paint that in with the same colors that I was using for my tulip, which are my New Gamboge, which is a warm yellow, and the Pyrrole Red, which is a warm red. The circular petals at the bottom I paint in with New Gamboge, and then the trumpet structure I paint in with an orange that I created by mixing together New Gamboge and Pyrrole Red. With my secondary flowers painted in, it was now time to paint in the tertiary flowers and filler elements. So these are those very small daisies that I added in between the most important flowers. And I paint in some daisies with my yellow that I was just using for the bottom petals of that daffodil, and other daisies with a little bit more of an orange, which is the same orange that I use for the trumpet structure in that daffodil. But I do add in a little bit of burnt sienna, which is a reddish brown, into that mixture to paint in the central areas, to make those central areas a little bit more brown, a little bit more muted. And then for this final painting, I do decide to go in with a bit, just a bit of a second layer in all of these flowers, wet on dry now. So what I'm doing with my size 4 round brush here is I'm pushing shadow areas in all of these flowers a little bit more. All I am doing is going in on dry paper now and painting in abstract irregular shadow shapes doing a little bit more overlapping of color in those deepest, darkest areas, using exactly the same colors that I was using before for each flower, but simply doing a little bit more overlapping of paint wet on dry now to increase that darkness and level of contrast in the shadow areas and make these flowers pop a little bit more, especially the most important ones. I would advise not doing too much layering or too much detailing because we're trying to go for more expressive, looser results here, and it's very easy to lose that freshness if you do too much layering and finicking. Here I'm painting the stems with my smaller size 4 round brush and a mixture of my green from St. Petersburg White Nights, which is a warm, darker green, and a little bit of Winsor Lemon from Winsor & Newton's Professional line, which is a cool yellow, just to lighten it a little bit. I'm trying to create a subtle range of green values even in those stems. And finally, I'm going to be painting the background. This is completely optional. If you like the way that your piece looks as is with a white background, you can leave it as is. What I do to simplify the painting process for the background is I use the pre-wetting technique. So I'm going in with my large size 6 mop brush and taking a little bit of water at a time from my container to pre-wet the entire background area. And I really take my time with this process. I actually use a second smaller brush, which is my size 8 round brush, to go into the smaller, more complex areas because it's very difficult to go in with that larger brush in those very small areas. But I take my time pre-wetting the entire background area over and over until I arrive at a nice even sheen. I am very careful and very gentle when I am going over those smallest teeny tiny wildflowers with my large brush because I don't want to reactivate that paint that has already dried. But I'm really doing my best to avoid getting any water in those most important flowers. It's not enough to go over your background once or even twice or 3 times. You're going to have to do it multiple times and continue coming back to that place where you started over and over again as you're making your way toward the opposite edge. If you're starting on the left and you're making your way toward the right, you want to continue coming back to that left edge where you started over and over again as you're continuing to make your way toward the right edge. Because if you just go in a linear fashion, making your way from left to right, top to bottom, or whatever the case may be, by the time you reach the opposite edge, that edge where you started is already going to be dry. And the entire point of doing pre-wetting in the background is to arrive at soft, diffused, wet on wet effects, and also to expand our working time. Because what you have to remember is that dry paper is thirsty paper. And when it comes to painting large areas with watercolor, it can be stressful because you feel like you're racing against the clock. And if you haven't developed that skill to paint very quickly and with just the right amount of paint and water in your bristles, it can be very easy to arrive at a lot of undesired lines and marks and textures throughout this area that you're looking to be relatively smooth or soft looking. So by doing pre-wetting, you're expanding the amount of time that you have available before things start to dry on you, and that water content that you prepare the paper with is going to do half of the work for you in terms of creating those soft effects. I did paint in the smaller, more complex sections in between my stems and petal areas later, separately, wet on dry with my smaller brush, so I didn't worry about pre-wetting those smaller areas in the center. Just the larger majority of that background. I picked yellow for my background, which I thought would be a nice color for the season we're in, and that would also go well with the colors of the flowers that I've included. I use both my Winsor Lemon from Winsor & Newton as well as my new Gamboge, just for a little bit of a tonal variation throughout that background and a variation in hue as well. And I just continue playing with the background until I arrive at something that I like. And because everything is wet and workable, due to the fact that I use that pre-wetting technique, I can take a little bit longer dropping in color and gently moving that color around until I arrive at something that I enjoy. Alright you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys!